Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is a powerful cognitive phenomenon where people rely too heavily on the first piece of information they encounter when making decisions. This initial information becomes an anchor that influences all subsequent judgments, even when that anchor is completely irrelevant or arbitrary. The human mind has a tendency to latch onto this first reference point and then make adjustments from there, but these adjustments are typically insufficient, keeping the final decision uncomfortably close to the original anchor. This psychological trap manifests in countless everyday situations. When negotiating the price of a car, the initial asking price serves as an anchor that influences both the buyer and seller throughout the entire negotiation process. Even if both parties know the starting price is inflated, it still affects their perception of what constitutes a reasonable final price. Real estate agents exploit this bias by showing expensive properties first, making subsequent properties seem more affordable by comparison. The anchoring effect operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, making it particularly insidious. People often believe they are making rational, independent judgments when they are actually being heavily influenced by irrelevant information presented earlier. Researchers have demonstrated this effect in laboratory settings where participants were asked to estimate various quantities after being exposed to random numbers. Even when explicitly told that these numbers were meaningless, participants' estimates were still pulled toward the anchor values. In marketing and sales contexts, anchoring bias becomes a tool of manipulation. Retailers use high, original prices to make sale prices seem like incredible bargains. Restaurants place expensive items at the top of their menus to make moderately priced options appear reasonable. Subscription services offer premium tiers that few people actually want, but which make the standard tier seem like the sensible middle choice. The danger of anchoring bias extends beyond commercial transactions into critical life decisions. Job seekers might accept lower salaries because the first offer they received set a low anchor. Medical professionals might stick too closely to their initial diagnosis, failing to adequately consider alternative possibilities. Judges have been shown to give harsher sentences when exposed to higher sentencing recommendations, even from irrelevant sources. Understanding anchoring bias is the first step toward reducing its influence. By consciously seeking multiple reference points, questioning initial information, and deliberately considering a wide range of possibilities, individuals can make more balanced and rational decisions. False scarcity. False scarcity is a manipulative psychological tactic that artificially creates the impression of limited availability or urgency to pressure people into making quick decisions. This strategy exploits our deep-seated evolutionary fear of missing out on valuable resources, triggering an immediate emotional response that bypasses rational thinking. When people believe something is scarce or running out, they tend to assign it higher value and act more impulsively, often making purchases or commitments they would otherwise avoid. The power of false scarcity lies in how it hijacks our decision-making process. Throughout human evolution, genuinely scarce resources meant survival or death, so our brains developed rapid response mechanisms to secure limited goods. Modern marketers and manipulators exploit this ancient wiring by creating artificial time limits, limited quantities, or exclusive access that may not actually exist. The urgency created by perceived scarcity overwhelms our ability to think clearly and evaluate options thoroughly. This tactic appears everywhere in contemporary life. Online retailers display countdown timers showing how long a sale will last, even though the same sale might run indefinitely. Hotels and travel booking sites claim only a few rooms remain at a certain price, creating pressure to book immediately. Limited edition products are released not because resources are actually limited, but because exclusivity drives demand. Social media platforms use false scarcity by showing limited availability for popular events or products. The psychological impact of false scarcity extends beyond simple purchasing decisions. It creates a state of artificial stress and anxiety that clouds judgment. People operating under perceived time pressure are more likely to accept unfavorable terms, skip important research, and ignore warning signs. This mental state makes individuals vulnerable to additional manipulation techniques, as their cognitive resources are focused on the immediate threat of missing out rather than on careful evaluation. False scarcity becomes particularly dangerous when applied to important life decisions. Job offers with artificial deadlines, investment opportunities with limited windows, or relationship ultimatums all use this same psychological pressure. The manufactured urgency prevents people from seeking advice, comparing alternatives, or simply taking time to think through the consequences of their choices. Recognizing false scarcity requires stepping back and asking critical questions. Is the deadline real or arbitrary? Are there actually limited quantities, or is this just marketing language? What would happen if you waited? Taking time to verify claims and seek additional information often reveals that the urgency was manufactured rather than genuine. Framing manipulation. Framing manipulation is the deliberate presentation of information in a way that influences how people perceive and respond to that information, without changing the actual facts. This psychological technique exploits how human brains process information by focusing attention on certain aspects while downplaying others. The same set of facts can be presented in multiple ways, each creating dramatically different emotional responses and leading to different decisions, even though the underlying reality remains unchanged. The power of framing lies in its ability to shape perception without lying or withholding information. A medical treatment with a 90% success rate sounds much more appealing than one with a 10% failure rate, despite both statements describing identical outcomes. Political candidates frame tax policies as either tax relief or revenue reduction, with each phrase triggering different emotional associations in voters' minds. The choice of words, context, and emphasis can completely alter how people interpret and respond to the same factual information. Framing manipulation operates through several psychological mechanisms. Humans naturally focus on the most prominent or emotionally charged aspects of information, often missing subtler but equally important details. The frame acts as a mental shortcut, providing a ready-made interpretation that saves cognitive effort. Once a frame is established, it becomes difficult to see the information from alternative perspectives, as the initial framing creates a mental pathway that subsequent thinking tends to follow. This technique appears extensively in media, marketing, and political communication. News outlets frame stories to emphasize certain angles while minimizing others, shaping public opinion without technically misrepresenting facts. Advertisers frame products in terms of gains rather than costs, or emphasize what customers will avoid losing rather than what they might gain. Insurance companies frame their products as protection against catastrophic loss rather than as expensive monthly payments for unlikely events. The manipulation becomes particularly insidious when it exploits emotional vulnerabilities or existing biases. Fear-based framing makes people more receptive to security measures that might otherwise seem excessive. Positive framing can make risky investments seem like safe opportunities. Social framing can make individual choices seem like group decisions, increasing compliance through perceived peer pressure. Framing manipulation extends beyond commercial and political contexts into personal relationships and social interactions. The way conflicts are framed can determine whether they escalate or resolve peacefully. How personal achievements are framed affects self-esteem and motivation. Even internal self-talk involves framing, as people can interpret the same personal experiences as either failures or learning opportunities. Defending against framing manipulation requires conscious effort to consider alternative perspectives and seek additional context. By asking how the same information might be presented differently, looking for what might be emphasized or minimized, and considering who benefits from a particular framing, individuals can develop more balanced and independent judgments. Social proof exploitation. Social proof exploitation is the manipulation of people's natural tendency to look to others for guidance on how to behave, think, or make decisions. This psychological phenomenon stems from our evolutionary heritage as social creatures who survived by following group behaviors and conforming to social norms. When people are uncertain about what to do, they automatically scan their environment for cues about what others are doing, assuming that the crowd's behavior represents the correct or safe choice. The exploitation of social proof works by artificially manufacturing the appearance of widespread adoption, approval, or participation. Manipulators create false impressions of popularity, consensus, or social acceptance to influence individual behavior. This can involve fabricated testimonials, inflated user numbers, fake reviews, or staged demonstrations of mass participation. The goal is to trigger the automatic psychological response that says if everyone else is doing something, it must be the right thing to do. This manipulation technique appears across numerous contexts in modern life. Online platforms display inflated user counts, fake positive reviews, and artificial engagement metrics to suggest widespread popularity. Political movements use staged rallies, coordinated social media campaigns, and amplified messaging to create impressions of grassroots support. Marketing campaigns feature testimonials from supposedly satisfied customers, celebrity endorsements, and claims about how many people have already purchased a product. The psychological power of social proof exploitation lies in how it bypasses critical thinking. When people see evidence that others have made a particular choice, they often skip the process of independent evaluation and simply follow the apparent crowd. This mental shortcut saves cognitive energy but makes individuals vulnerable to manipulation when the social proof is artificially created rather than genuine. Social proof exploitation becomes particularly dangerous in digital environments where it's easy to manufacture false consensus. Bots can create fake social media engagement, algorithmic systems can amplify certain messages while suppressing others, and coordinated campaigns can make fringe opinions appear mainstream. The speed and scale of digital communication means false social proof can spread faster than fact-checking can occur. The technique also exploits different types of social proof for maximum effectiveness. Similarity-based social proof suggests that people like you are making certain choices. Authority-based social proof implies that experts or respected figures endorse particular options. Wisdom of crowd social proof suggests that large numbers of people can't be wrong. Each type triggers slightly different psychological responses but all bypass individual critical thinking. The consequences of social proof exploitation extend beyond individual poor decisions to broader social problems. It can amplify dangerous behaviors, spread misinformation, create artificial political polarization, and undermine genuine democratic processes. When people base their choices on manipulated social proof rather than accurate information, entire communities can be led toward harmful outcomes. Developing resistance to social proof exploitation requires conscious skepticism about apparent consensus and active verification of social proof claims. This means looking for independent confirmation, questioning the source of social proof information, and maintaining willingness to think independently even when it means going against apparent crowd behavior. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the psychological discomfort that occurs when a person holds contradictory beliefs, values, or attitudes simultaneously, or when their actions conflict with their stated beliefs. This mental tension creates an uncomfortable state that the mind automatically seeks to resolve, often leading to rationalization, denial, or belief modification rather than honest self-examination. The human brain has a powerful drive for internal consistency, and when that consistency is threatened, it will go to great lengths to restore psychological harmony. The manipulation of cognitive dissonance works by deliberately creating situations where people's actions conflict with their self-image or stated values, then providing convenient justifications that allow them to maintain their positive self-perception. This technique is particularly effective because it exploits the mind's natural tendency to resolve internal conflicts in ways that preserve ego and existing beliefs rather than acknowledge uncomfortable truths about oneself. This psychological phenomenon manifests in countless everyday situations. People who consider themselves environmentally conscious might drive gas-guzzling vehicles, resolving the dissonance by telling themselves they need the vehicle for safety or that individual actions don't matter. Individuals who pride themselves on being rational might hold superstitious beliefs, reconciling this contradiction by claiming their superstitions are just harmless traditions rather than genuine beliefs. Manipulators exploit cognitive dissonance by first getting people to make small commitments or take minor actions that align with desired behaviors, then gradually escalating the requests. Once someone has acted in a particular way, they experience pressure to maintain consistency with that action, even when later requests become unreasonable. This technique, known as foot-in-the-door manipulation, works because people prefer to see themselves as consistent rather than admit they made poor initial choices. The business world extensively uses cognitive dissonance manipulation. Companies encourage customers to make small initial purchases or commitments, knowing that people will then feel pressure to justify those decisions by making larger purchases later. Multi-level marketing schemes exploit this by getting people to make initial investments, after which the participants feel compelled to recruit others to justify their own involvement rather than admit they were deceived. Political and social movements also weaponize cognitive dissonance. They encourage people to make public statements or take visible action supporting the cause, knowing that once someone has publicly committed, they will experience intense pressure to maintain that position even when presented with contradictory evidence. The public nature of the commitment makes it even more difficult to change course without admitting error. The resolution of cognitive dissonance often involves sophisticated mental gymnastics that allow people to maintain contradictory positions without acknowledging the contradiction. This can include compartmentalization, where conflicting beliefs are kept separate and never directly compared, or rationalization, where elaborate justifications are constructed to explain away obvious contradictions. Understanding cognitive dissonance is crucial for maintaining intellectual honesty and making authentic choices. It requires developing comfort with uncertainty, admitting mistakes, and changing beliefs when presented with compelling evidence, even when such changes are psychologically uncomfortable. Repetition hypnosis. Repetition hypnosis is a psychological technique that uses constant repetition of messages, phrases, or ideas to bypass critical thinking and implant beliefs directly into the subconscious mind. This method exploits the brain's natural tendency to accept familiar information as true, regardless of its actual validity. When people encounter the same message repeatedly, their minds begin to process it as background noise, reducing skeptical analysis while simultaneously increasing acceptance through mere familiarity. The power of repetition hypnosis lies in how it works below the threshold of conscious awareness. Unlike obvious persuasion attempts that trigger mental defenses, repeated messages slip past critical faculties by appearing routine and unremarkable. The brain's pattern recognition systems interpret frequent repetition as evidence of importance or truth, creating a false sense of validity that has nothing to do with actual facts or logic. This technique appears extensively in advertising, where brands repeat slogans, jingles, and key messages until they become automatically associated with positive feelings or perceived needs. Political propaganda uses repetition hypnosis to make controversial ideas seem normal and acceptable through constant exposure. Social media algorithms amplify this effect by showing users the same types of content repeatedly, gradually shifting their perception of what constitutes normal opinion or behavior. The psychological mechanism behind repetition hypnosis involves several cognitive biases working together. The mere exposure effect makes people prefer things they've encountered before, while the availability heuristic makes frequently heard information seem more important or likely to be true. Repetition also creates false memories, as people begin to remember hearing information from multiple sources when it actually came from repeated exposure to a single source. Repetition hypnosis becomes particularly dangerous when combined with emotional content. Messages that trigger fear, anger, or other strong emotions become more memorable and persuasive when repeated, creating powerful psychological conditioning. This combination can lead people to develop intense beliefs or emotional reactions to topics they previously considered unimportant or neutral. The technique works most effectively when the repeated messages are embedded in entertaining or engaging content that people seek out voluntarily. Television shows, movies, music, and social media content can all serve as vehicles for repetition hypnosis, making the target audience complicit in their own psychological conditioning. The entertainment value masks the manipulative intent while ensuring repeated exposure. Modern digital environments have amplified the power of repetition hypnosis through personalized algorithms that can deliver precisely targeted repeated messages to specific individuals. These systems can identify which messages resonate with particular personality types and repeat them with surgical precision, creating highly effective psychological conditioning tailored to individual vulnerabilities. The long-term effects of repetition hypnosis extend beyond immediate behavioral changes to fundamental shifts in worldview and identity. People who are subjected to consistent repetition of certain messages may gradually adopt those ideas as core beliefs, losing awareness that these beliefs originated from external manipulation rather than personal reflection or experience. Defending against repetition hypnosis requires conscious effort to seek diverse information sources, question familiar messages, and maintain awareness of how repetition can create false impressions of truth or importance. It also involves recognizing when certain ideas or phrases appear with suspicious frequency across different contexts. Priming. Priming is the psychological phenomenon where exposure to certain stimuli influences subsequent thoughts, feelings, or behaviors without conscious awareness. This subtle manipulation technique works by activating specific mental associations or concepts that then affect how people interpret new information or make decisions. The primed concepts remain just below conscious awareness but significantly influence cognitive processing, creating predictable changes in perception and behavior that the affected person attributes to their own independent thinking. The mechanism of priming operates through the interconnected nature of human memory and cognition. When certain ideas, words, images, or concepts are introduced into a person's mental environment, they activate related neural networks that remain heightened for extended periods. This activation makes associated thoughts and behaviors more likely to occur, even when the original priming stimulus is no longer present or consciously remembered. Priming manifests in numerous subtle ways throughout daily life. Restaurants use warm lighting and comfortable music to prime feelings of relaxation and indulgence, making customers more likely to order expensive items or additional courses. Retail environments employ specific colors, scents, and layouts to prime purchasing behaviors. News media prime emotional responses through carefully chosen images and language that precede factual reporting, influencing how audiences interpret subsequent information. The manipulation becomes particularly sophisticated when primes are designed to target specific psychological states or decision-making processes. Financial advisors might prime concepts of security and stability before discussing conservative investment options, or prime ideas of growth and opportunity before presenting riskier alternatives. Job interviewers unconsciously prime candidates through office decor, conversation topics, and body language that influence the candidate's performance and self-presentation. Political communication extensively uses priming to shape public opinion without appearing manipulative. Campaign advertisements prime emotional associations with candidates through background music, visual imagery, and symbolic references that have nothing to do with policy positions. News coverage primes certain interpretive frameworks by choosing which aspects of stories to emphasize or which experts to feature, influencing how audiences understand complex issues. The power of priming lies in its invisibility to the target. People experience the effects of priming as their own authentic thoughts and preferences, making them resistant to suggestions that they are being influenced. This creates a false sense of autonomous decision-making while actually following predictable patterns established by external manipulation. Digital environments have created unprecedented opportunities for sophisticated priming through personalized content delivery. Social media platforms and search engines can prime specific emotional states or conceptual frameworks through carefully curated feeds that prepare users to respond favorably to targeted advertisements or political messages. The algorithms can test different priming approaches and optimize them for maximum effectiveness with specific personality types. Subliminal priming, where stimuli are presented below the threshold of conscious perception, represents the most covert form of this manipulation. While dramatic claims about subliminal advertising are often exaggerated, research confirms that briefly presented words or images can influence subsequent thoughts and behaviors even when people cannot consciously recall seeing them. The cumulative effect of constant priming in modern environments may be reshaping fundamental aspects of human psychology and social behavior. When people are continuously exposed to priming stimuli through media, advertising, and digital platforms, their thoughts and preferences may become increasingly influenced by external manipulation rather than genuine personal reflection. Overloading with information. Overloading with information is a manipulation technique that deliberately overwhelms people with excessive amounts of data, facts, options, or complex details to impair their decision-making abilities and make them more susceptible to influence. This psychological attack exploits the limited capacity of human cognitive processing by flooding the mind with more information than it can effectively analyze. When people become overwhelmed by information overload, they often abandon careful evaluation and instead rely on mental shortcuts, emotional responses, or external guidance to make decisions. The manipulation works by deliberately exceeding the brain's processing capacity, forcing people into a state of cognitive exhaustion where critical thinking becomes difficult or impossible. In this overwhelmed state, individuals become more likely to accept simplified solutions, follow authority figures, or make impulsive choices just to escape the discomfort of information paralysis. The overload creates a psychological vulnerability that skilled manipulators can exploit to guide people toward predetermined conclusions. This technique appears frequently in sales environments where customers are bombarded with technical specifications, warranty options, financing alternatives, and add-on features until they become too confused to make informed comparisons. Insurance sales often involve information overload, presenting dozens of coverage options and policy details that make it nearly impossible for consumers to identify the best value. Investment schemes use information overload by presenting complex financial data and projections that obscure the actual risks involved. Information overload manipulation also appears in political contexts where complex policy issues are buried under avalanches of statistics, expert opinions, and technical details that make it difficult for citizens to understand the real implications of proposed changes. Politicians may deliberately complicate simple issues to avoid accountability, knowing that confused voters are more likely to rely on emotional appeals or party loyalty rather than informed analysis. The digital age has dramatically amplified the potential for information overload manipulation. Online platforms can instantly deliver unlimited amounts of information on any topic, making it easy to overwhelm users with more data than they can process. Search engines, social media feeds, and news aggregators can be manipulated to flood people with information that appears comprehensive but is actually designed to create confusion rather than clarity. The psychological impact of information overload extends beyond poor decision-making to include increased stress, anxiety, and learned helplessness. When people repeatedly find themselves unable to process available information effectively, they may begin to doubt their own judgment and become more dependent on external authorities for guidance. This psychological state makes them vulnerable to additional manipulation techniques. Information overload manipulation becomes particularly dangerous when combined with time pressure. When people must make decisions quickly while processing excessive information, they almost inevitably resort to heuristics and emotional responses rather than careful analysis. This combination is frequently used in high-pressure sales situations and emergency decision-making contexts. The technique also exploits the illusion of thoroughness, where the sheer volume of information makes people feel they have been comprehensive in their research, even though the information may have been carefully curated to support particular conclusions. This false sense of due diligence can lead to misplaced confidence in poor decisions. Defending against information overload requires developing strategies for filtering and prioritizing information, setting boundaries on research time, and recognizing when excessive complexity may be deliberately manufactured to impair judgment rather than provide genuine insight. Ben Franklin Effect. The Ben Franklin effect is a fascinating psychological phenomenon that reveals how our actions can actually change our feelings toward others, rather than the other way around. This counterintuitive concept suggests that when we do someone a favor, we tend to like them more afterward, not less. The effect is named after Benjamin Franklin, who discovered this principle through his own experience with a political rival. The story goes that Franklin once had a difficult relationship with a fellow legislator who consistently opposed him. Instead of trying to win the man over through charm or gifts, Franklin took a different approach. He asked his rival to lend him a rare book from his personal library. The man agreed, and when Franklin returned the book with a thank you note, their relationship transformed. The former adversary became much more friendly and cooperative, and they maintained a good relationship for the rest of their lives. This psychological principle operates through what researchers call cognitive dissonance reduction. When we perform a favor for someone, especially someone we previously disliked or felt neutral toward, our brain experiences an uncomfortable conflict. We think to ourselves, why would I help this person if I don't like them? To resolve this mental discomfort, we unconsciously adjust our feelings to match our actions. We convince ourselves that we must actually like the person, otherwise we wouldn't have helped them. The Ben Franklin effect works because it's easier for our minds to change our attitudes than to accept that we acted inconsistently with our beliefs. This mental adjustment happens automatically and often without our conscious awareness. The effect is particularly powerful because the person we helped didn't force us to do the favor, we chose to do it ourselves, which makes the attitude change feel more genuine and lasting. This principle has practical applications in building relationships, networking, and conflict resolution. Instead of trying to impress someone by doing things for them, asking them to do small favors for you can be more effective. It works in professional settings, friendships, and even romantic relationships. The key is to start with small, reasonable requests that the person can easily fulfill, which creates a foundation of positive feelings that can grow over time. Understanding the Ben Franklin effect helps explain why volunteer work often creates strong bonds between people, why hazing rituals can increase group loyalty, and why getting involved in helping others often leads to deeper emotional connections than simply receiving help. The Pagan effect. I need to clarify that the Pagan effect is not a recognized psychological concept in academic literature or established psychological research. It's possible this might be a misremembering or variation of another psychological phenomenon, or perhaps a concept from a specific context I'm not familiar with. However, Let me address what this might refer to and provide insight into similar psychological effects that might align with what you're looking for. There are several psychological phenomena that involve perception, bias, or cognitive effects that could be similar to what Pagan effect might describe. One possibility is that this refers to a form of confirmation bias or selective attention, where people tend to notice and remember information that confirms their existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. Another possibility is that it relates to the availability heuristic, where people judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. If Pagan effect refers to a specific bias in how people process information or make judgments, it would likely involve the systematic ways our minds can be influenced or misled. Many psychological effects demonstrate how our perceptions can be distorted by various factors including prior experiences, emotional states, social pressures, or cognitive limitations. Without a clear definition of the Pagan effect from established psychological research, I cannot provide an accurate explanation of its mechanisms, applications, or implications. Psychological effects are typically named after researchers who discovered them, documented through peer-reviewed studies, and validated through replication. If you have a specific source or context where you encountered the Pagan effect, that would help me provide more targeted information. Alternatively, if you meant a different psychological concept that sounds similar, such as the Pygmalion effect, which deals with expectations influencing performance, I would be happy to explain that instead. Could you clarify what specific psychological phenomenon you're referring to, or provide more context about where you encountered this term? This would allow me to give you the detailed explanation you're looking for. Negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is a psychological manipulation technique that involves removing an unpleasant stimulus to increase the likelihood of a desired behavior. Unlike punishment, which adds something negative, negative reinforcement takes away something uncomfortable or threatening when the target person complies with demands or behaves in the desired manner. This concept operates on the principle that people will naturally gravitate toward behaviors that help them escape discomfort, pain, or stress. Manipulators exploit this human tendency by first creating or maintaining an uncomfortable situation, then offering relief only when their targets submit to their wishes. The removal of the negative stimulus serves as a reward, making the compliant behavior more likely to occur again in the future. In manipulative relationships, negative reinforcement often manifests as emotional withdrawal, silent treatment, criticism, or tension that suddenly disappears when the victim behaves according to the manipulator's expectations. For example, an abusive partner might stop giving the silent treatment only when their partner apologizes for something they did not actually do wrong. The relief from the uncomfortable silence reinforces the apologetic behavior, even though it was unwarranted. Workplace environments frequently see negative reinforcement through micromanagement, unrealistic deadlines, or hostile atmospheres that only improve when employees comply with unreasonable demands. The temporary relief from pressure becomes addictive, creating a cycle where victims continuously seek to avoid the negative stimulus by conforming to the manipulator's wishes. The insidious nature of negative reinforcement lies in its ability to make victims feel grateful for the absence of mistreatment rather than recognizing they should never have been mistreated in the first place. This psychological trap creates dependency and learned helplessness, where individuals become increasingly focused on avoiding negative consequences rather than pursuing positive outcomes. Understanding negative reinforcement is crucial for recognizing when someone is using your natural desire to escape discomfort against you. Healthy relationships and environments should not require you to constantly walk on eggshells or perform specific behaviors to avoid punishment or discomfort. Recognizing this pattern is the first step toward breaking free from manipulative cycles and establishing healthier boundaries. Deliberate misinterpretation. Deliberate misinterpretation is a manipulative tactic where someone intentionally twists, distorts, or misunderstands another person's words, actions, or intentions to serve their own agenda. This psychological manipulation involves the conscious choice to interpret communications in the most unfavorable or convenient way possible, regardless of the speaker's actual meaning or intent. The manipulator using deliberate misinterpretation operates with full awareness of what the other person truly meant but chooses to respond to a fabricated version of their statement instead. This creates confusion, frustration, and self-doubt in the victim, who finds themselves constantly having to clarify, defend, or re-explain their perfectly clear communications. The manipulator benefits by controlling the narrative, avoiding accountability, or gaining the upper hand in arguments. This tactic frequently appears in gaslighting scenarios, where the manipulator consistently misinterprets the victim's words to make them question their own communication skills or sanity. For instance, when someone says they feel hurt by a particular behavior, the manipulator might respond with something like, "So you're saying I'm a terrible person," forcing the victim to backtrack and reassure the manipulator instead of addressing their original concern. In professional settings, deliberate misinterpretation can manifest as supervisors or colleagues twisting instructions, feedback, or requests to avoid responsibilities or create conflicts. A manager might deliberately misunderstand an employee's request for clarification as insubordination, or misinterpret constructive feedback as personal attacks. The psychological impact of deliberate misinterpretation is profound because it attacks the fundamental human need for understanding and connection. Victims often begin second-guessing their communication style, over-explaining simple concepts, or avoiding important conversations altogether. They may develop anxiety around expressing themselves, fearing their words will be twisted against them. Recognizing deliberate misinterpretation requires paying attention to patterns rather than isolated incidents. When someone consistently misunderstands you in ways that benefit them or put you at a disadvantage, despite your clear communication, you are likely dealing with this manipulation tactic. Healthy communication involves good faith efforts to understand others, not weaponizing misunderstanding for personal gain. Confession triggers. Confession triggers are psychological manipulation techniques designed to compel individuals to reveal personal information, admit to wrongdoings, or disclose secrets they would normally keep private. These tactics exploit human vulnerabilities such as guilt, fear, empathy, or the desire for connection to extract confessions or sensitive information that can later be used against the person. The manipulator employing confession triggers creates specific emotional or psychological conditions that make their target feel compelled to share information. This might involve establishing false intimacy, creating artificial urgency, or manufacturing guilt that can only be relieved through confession. The technique relies on the human tendency to seek relief from psychological pressure through disclosure, even when such disclosure is not in their best interest. Common confession triggers include false empathy, where the manipulator shares their own fabricated vulnerabilities to encourage reciprocal sharing. They might say something like, "I struggle with this too, and it helps to talk about it," creating an illusion of mutual trust while actually fishing for information. Another approach involves creating artificial time pressure, suggesting that confession now is the only way to avoid worse consequences later. Interrogation professionals and cult leaders frequently use confession triggers through techniques like good cop bad cop routines, where relief from aggressive questioning comes only through admission. They create psychological pressure through repetitive questioning, implied knowledge of wrongdoing, or suggestions that confession will bring relief and forgiveness. In personal relationships, confession triggers might appear as emotional manipulation where someone creates drama or distress that can only be resolved through the target revealing personal information. A manipulative partner might manufacture jealousy or insecurity, then suggest that complete honesty about past relationships is the only way to restore trust. The psychological impact of falling victim to confession triggers extends beyond the immediate disclosure. Victims often experience deep regret, violated trust, and vulnerability once they realize their confessions were extracted through manipulation rather than genuine care or necessity. This can lead to increased guardedness, difficulty trusting others, and shame about having been manipulated. Protecting yourself from confession triggers requires recognizing when someone is creating artificial pressure for disclosure. Healthy relationships allow for natural sharing without coercion, manufactured urgency, or emotional manipulation. Trust should be built gradually through consistent behavior, not extracted through psychological pressure tactics. Pacing and leading. Pacing and leading is a sophisticated psychological manipulation technique that involves first matching or mirroring someone's current emotional state, behavior patterns, or beliefs, then gradually guiding them toward a desired outcome or mindset. This method exploits the human tendency to trust and follow those who seem to understand and share our experiences, creating a false sense of rapport that can be weaponized for manipulation. The pacing phase requires the manipulator to carefully observe and mirror their target's communication style, emotional state, values, or concerns. They demonstrate understanding and agreement with the person's current situation, creating an illusion of empathy and shared perspective. This builds trust and makes the target feel heard and validated, lowering their psychological defenses and increasing their receptivity to influence. Once rapport is established through pacing, the leading phase begins. The manipulator gradually introduces new ideas, suggestions, or behaviors while maintaining the appearance of understanding and support. They slowly shift the conversation or relationship dynamic toward their intended goal, using the established trust as leverage. The transition from pacing to leading is typically so subtle that the target remains unaware they are being guided rather than making independent choices. Sales professionals and cult recruiters frequently employ pacing and leading by initially agreeing with potential targets about their frustrations, problems, or desires. They demonstrate deep understanding of the person's situation, then gradually introduce their product, ideology, or solution as the natural answer to those concerns. The target feels as though they have discovered the solution themselves rather than being sold to. In abusive relationships, pacing and leading might involve a partner initially showing complete understanding and support for their victim's independence, career goals, or friendships. Once trust and emotional dependency are established, they gradually introduce restrictions, criticisms, or alternative perspectives that slowly isolate the victim from their support systems and previous beliefs about healthy relationships. The effectiveness of pacing and leading lies in its ability to bypass critical thinking by creating emotional connection first. When people feel understood and supported, they are more likely to accept new ideas without thorough examination. The manipulator appears to be a trusted advisor rather than someone with their own agenda. Recognizing pacing and leading requires paying attention to whether someone's initial understanding and support leads to pressure for specific changes in your thinking or behavior. Genuine support respects your autonomy and does not come with hidden agendas or expectations for reciprocal changes in your life choices. The decoy effect. The decoy effect is a cognitive bias manipulation technique where an inferior option is deliberately introduced to make a target option appear more attractive by comparison. This psychological manipulation exploits the human tendency to make decisions based on relative comparisons rather than absolute value, steering people toward predetermined choices while maintaining the illusion of free will and rational decision-making. The decoy effect operates through the strategic placement of a third option that is clearly inferior to the preferred choice but similar enough to provide contrast. This asymmetrically dominated option makes the target choice appear significantly more valuable, reasonable, or attractive than it would in isolation. The manipulator benefits by increasing the likelihood that their preferred outcome will be selected, while the victim believes they are making an independent, logical decision. Marketing professionals extensively use decoy pricing strategies to influence consumer behavior. A classic example involves movie theater popcorn pricing, where a small costs $4, a large costs $6.50, and a medium costs $6. The overpriced medium serves as a decoy that makes the large appear like exceptional value, driving customers toward the high-profit large option they might not have chosen without the comparison. In personal manipulation scenarios, the decoy effect might appear when someone presents 3 relationship options, job opportunities, or life choices. They deliberately include one obviously poor option to make their preferred choice seem reasonable and attractive. For instance, a manipulative partner might threaten to leave, suggest an open relationship, or propose couples therapy, using the first 2 undesirable options as decoys to make therapy seem like the obvious reasonable compromise. Political manipulation frequently employs decoy candidates or policies to make preferred options appear more moderate or appealing. Extreme positions are introduced not with the expectation of adoption, but to shift the perceived center ground toward the manipulator's actual desired outcome. The decoy positions make previously unreasonable demands seem like reasonable compromises. The psychological power of the decoy effect lies in its ability to manipulate without appearing manipulative. Victims genuinely believe they are making rational choices based on available options, unaware that the option set has been carefully constructed to guide their decision. This maintains their sense of autonomy while achieving the manipulator's desired outcome. Protecting yourself from decoy effects requires recognizing when option sets seem artificially constructed or when one choice appears obviously inferior. Consider each option independently rather than in comparison, and be suspicious when presented with exactly 3 choices where one seems deliberately unappealing. False equivalence. False equivalence is a manipulative logical fallacy that presents 2 or more opposing arguments, positions, or behaviors as equally valid, reasonable, or problematic when they are actually significantly different in terms of evidence, severity, or moral weight. This technique creates artificial balance between unequal concepts, allowing manipulators to defend indefensible positions or deflect criticism by suggesting all parties are equally at fault. The manipulator using false equivalence deliberately ignores crucial differences in scale, context, evidence, or impact to create the impression that contrasting positions deserve equal consideration or condemnation. This technique exploits people's desire for fairness and balanced thinking, making them feel obligated to treat fundamentally different situations as comparable. The result is moral confusion and paralyzed decision-making that benefits the manipulator's agenda. In personal relationships, false equivalence might appear when an abusive partner compares their violence to their victim's verbal complaints, suggesting both behaviors are equally harmful. They might say something like, "You yell at me, and I push you, so we both have anger problems," completely ignoring the vast difference between verbal expression and physical violence. This creates false moral equivalency that minimizes serious abuse while making the victim feel partially responsible. Political manipulation frequently employs false equivalence to normalize extreme positions or deflect criticism. A politician caught in corruption might point to minor procedural violations by opponents, suggesting all politicians are equally corrupt. This technique shifts focus from specific serious wrongdoing to generalized cynicism about all political actors, reducing accountability and public engagement. Media manipulation through false equivalence presents fringe theories alongside established science, giving equal airtime and credibility to positions with vastly different evidence bases. Climate change denial, vaccine misinformation, or conspiracy theories receive treatment equivalent to peer-reviewed research, creating public confusion about well-established scientific consensus. The psychological impact of false equivalence extends beyond individual interactions to broader social discourse. When people repeatedly encounter false equivalencies, they may develop cynical worldviews where nothing can be trusted or evaluated meaningfully. This learned helplessness in moral and factual judgment serves authoritarian interests by reducing citizens' ability to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate authority. Recognizing false equivalence requires examining the actual evidence, scale, and impact of compared situations rather than accepting surface-level similarities. Consider whether the comparison serves to deflect accountability or minimize serious issues. Genuine moral reasoning acknowledges that not all actions, positions, or behaviors carry equal weight or deserve equal consideration. Mirror effect. Mirror effect is a psychological manipulation technique where someone reflects back another person's emotions, behaviors, values, or communication style to create artificial rapport and trust. This mirroring goes beyond natural social synchronization to become a calculated strategy for gaining influence, extracting information, or manipulating decision-making. The manipulator essentially becomes a psychological chameleon, adapting their presentation to match what they believe will be most appealing or disarming to their target. The mirror effect operates on the psychological principle that people are naturally drawn to those who seem similar to themselves. When someone mirrors our speech patterns, body language, interests, or opinions, it triggers subconscious feelings of familiarity and connection. Manipulators exploit this biological tendency by carefully observing their targets and then reflecting back carefully selected traits that will maximize their influence and minimize suspicion or resistance. Unlike genuine rapport building, the mirror effect is entirely strategic and one-sided. The manipulator has no authentic investment in the similarities they display, viewing them purely as tools for achieving their goals. They might mirror religious beliefs they do not hold, parenting philosophies they do not practice, or political views they actively oppose, all while maintaining convincing authenticity in their presentation. Professional con artists and cult recruiters are masters of the mirror effect, quickly adapting their personalities to match potential victims. They might present themselves as struggling single parents to other single parents, successful entrepreneurs to ambitious individuals, or spiritual seekers to those exploring personal growth. This chameleon-like ability allows them to bypass normal skepticism and establish trust rapidly. In romantic manipulation, the mirror effect appears when someone presents themselves as having identical interests, values, and life goals as their target. They become the perfect partner by reflecting back exactly what the other person seeks, creating an illusion of soulmate connection that masks their true intentions or incompatible nature. This false intimacy can lead to rapid relationship escalation and emotional dependency. The psychological damage from mirror effect manipulation extends beyond immediate deception. Victims often struggle with self-doubt about their ability to judge character and may become hypervigilant about others' authenticity. They question whether genuine connections exist or if everyone is potentially manipulating them through strategic presentation. Recognizing the mirror effect requires paying attention to how quickly and perfectly someone seems to match your interests and values. Genuine compatibility develops over time as people reveal authentic aspects of themselves, including differences and imperfections. Be cautious of those who seem too good to be true or who lack any contrasting opinions or experiences. Foot in the door technique. Foot in the door technique is a compliance manipulation strategy where someone begins with a small, seemingly reasonable request that most people would agree to, then gradually escalates to larger, more significant demands. This psychological manipulation exploits the human tendency toward consistency and the desire to maintain a coherent self-image once we have committed to a particular course of action or identity. The technique operates on the principle of commitment and consistency bias, where people feel psychological pressure to align their future actions with their previous decisions and stated beliefs. Once someone agrees to a small request, they unconsciously adjust their self-perception to see themselves as the type of person who helps, complies, or supports the requester's cause. This internal identity shift makes them more likely to agree to subsequent, larger requests to maintain consistency with their established pattern of behavior. The initial request in foot-in-the-door manipulation is carefully designed to be so reasonable or minimal that refusal would seem unreasonable or petty. It might involve signing a petition, answering a brief survey, accepting a small favor, or agreeing to a minor commitment. The key is that the first request establishes a relationship dynamic and creates a precedent for compliance without triggering the target's natural resistance to manipulation. Manipulative salespeople frequently use this technique by starting with product demonstrations, free trials, or small purchases before presenting expensive packages or long-term contracts. Once customers have invested time in the demonstration or made a small purchase, they feel committed to the process and more likely to justify larger expenditures to remain consistent with their initial engagement. In abusive relationships, the foot-in-the-door technique might begin with small requests for personal information, minor boundary crossings, or tiny favors that seem harmless individually. Each compliance makes the next request seem reasonable by comparison, gradually normalizing increasingly problematic behavior. The victim finds themselves trapped in a pattern of compliance that started with seemingly innocent interactions. Cult recruitment often employs foot-in-the-door strategies through free seminars, personality tests, or casual social gatherings. These low-commitment initial engagements allow recruiters to identify susceptible individuals and begin the gradual process of increasing involvement and commitment without triggering immediate resistance. The psychological power of this technique lies in its ability to transform external compliance into internal commitment. People begin to see themselves as supporters, helpers, or believers based on their pattern of small agreements, making larger requests feel natural rather than manipulative. Protecting yourself requires recognizing when small requests seem designed to establish precedents rather than address genuine immediate needs. Consider whether each request stands alone or appears part of a larger pattern designed to increase your commitment level gradually. Door-in-the-face technique. Door-in-the-face technique is a compliance manipulation strategy that involves making an extremely large, unreasonable request that will almost certainly be rejected, followed immediately by a smaller, more reasonable request that represents the manipulator's actual goal. This psychological manipulation exploits the human tendency toward reciprocal concessions and the desire to appear reasonable and cooperative after initially refusing to help someone. The technique operates on the principle of reciprocal concessions, where people feel obligated to make compromises when others appear to compromise first. When someone makes a large request and then significantly reduces their demands, it creates the illusion that they are being flexible and reasonable. The target feels psychological pressure to reciprocate this apparent concession by agreeing to the smaller request, even though the smaller request was the manipulator's intended goal from the beginning. The initial oversized request serves multiple psychological functions beyond creating contrast. It anchors expectations at an extreme level, making the real request seem modest by comparison. It also creates a sense of indebtedness, as the target feels the requester has backed down from their original position specifically to accommodate them. This false sense of compromise triggers guilt and obligation that the manipulator then leverages for compliance. Sales professionals frequently employ door-in-the-face tactics by initially presenting premium packages or services at high prices, then offering scaled-down versions at more reasonable costs. The customer feels they are receiving a concession and getting a better deal, when in reality they are purchasing exactly what the salesperson intended to sell from the beginning. The inflated initial offer serves only to make the real offer seem like a bargain. In personal relationships, this technique might appear when someone makes dramatic demands or threats, then retreats to what they actually wanted in the first place. An abusive partner might threaten to leave, demand complete control over finances, or suggest extreme restrictions, then compromise to more moderate control measures that still serve their manipulative goals while making the victim feel relieved and grateful. Political negotiation often involves door-in-the-face strategies where extreme initial positions are presented not with the expectation of acceptance, but to shift the perceived middle ground toward the negotiator's actual desired outcome. The subsequent compromise appears reasonable while actually representing significant concessions from the other party. The psychological effectiveness of this technique stems from its ability to make targets feel they have successfully negotiated or influenced the outcome. They believe they have obtained a better deal through their initial resistance, unaware that their final agreement was predetermined by the manipulator's strategic approach. Recognition requires understanding that genuine requests typically start at reasonable levels rather than extremes. Be suspicious of dramatic initial demands followed by convenient compromises that still serve the requester's interests substantially. The Zinnik effect. The Zinnik effect is a psychological manipulation technique where someone deliberately cultivates and spreads cynicism, distrust, and nihilistic attitudes to create emotional dependency and control over others. This manipulation involves systematically undermining people's faith in institutions, relationships, personal agency, and positive outcomes to position the manipulator as the only reliable source of truth, support, or protection in an otherwise hostile and meaningless world. The manipulator employing the Zinnik effect operates by consistently highlighting negative aspects of situations, emphasizing worst-case scenarios, and dismissing positive developments as temporary illusions or deliberate deceptions. They present themselves as uniquely enlightened individuals who see through societal lies and false promises, creating an intellectual hierarchy where cynicism equals sophistication and optimism equals naivety. This technique systematically erodes the target's natural resilience, hope, and independent problem-solving abilities by convincing them that effort is futile, trust is dangerous, and improvement is impossible. The manipulator becomes indispensable by positioning themselves as the only person who truly understands how terrible everything really is, while simultaneously offering themselves as the sole refuge from this manufactured hopelessness. In personal relationships, the Zinnik effect manifests when partners consistently undermine their victim's confidence in friends, family, career prospects, or personal goals. They might respond to every positive development with predictions of failure, every new friendship with warnings about ulterior motives, and every personal achievement with suggestions that success is temporary or undeserved. This creates learned helplessness and emotional dependency. Professional environments can harbor Zinnik effect manipulation through supervisors or colleagues who consistently emphasize organizational dysfunction, dismiss improvement efforts, and create cultures of learned helplessness. They position themselves as indispensable by being the only ones who supposedly understand how broken everything is, while simultaneously preventing others from developing independent solutions or maintaining morale. Social and political manipulation frequently employs the Zinnik effect through media figures or leaders who consistently emphasize societal breakdown, institutional failure, and individual powerlessness. They create dependency by positioning themselves as the only truthful voices in a world of lies, while systematically undermining people's faith in democratic processes, scientific institutions, or community organizations. The psychological damage from Zinnik effect manipulation extends far beyond immediate relationships, potentially creating lasting depression, anxiety, and inability to form healthy connections or pursue meaningful goals. Victims may develop worldviews so negative that they struggle to recognize genuine opportunities or trustworthy people. Protection requires maintaining perspective about both positive and negative aspects of situations, seeking multiple information sources, and recognizing when someone consistently promotes hopelessness while positioning themselves as uniquely insightful or indispensable. False flattery. False flattery is a manipulative tactic where someone gives insincere compliments or praise with the hidden agenda of gaining something in return. Unlike genuine appreciation, false flattery is calculated and strategic, designed to lower someone's defenses and make them more susceptible to requests, manipulation, or exploitation. This psychological technique works because humans have a fundamental need for validation and recognition. When someone compliments us, our brains release feel-good chemicals like dopamine, creating positive associations with that person. False flatterers exploit this biological response, using praise as a tool to build artificial rapport and trust. The key difference between genuine compliments and false flattery lies in the motivation and timing. Authentic praise comes naturally and focuses on specific, observable qualities or achievements. False flattery, however, is often generic, excessive, or conveniently timed just before a request. It might sound like, "You're so intelligent and successful," followed immediately by, "I was wondering if you could help me with something." False flatterers often study their targets to identify insecurities or areas where the person seeks validation. They then craft compliments that specifically address these vulnerable spots. For instance, if someone is self-conscious about their appearance, a manipulator might shower them with appearance-related compliments before asking for favors. This tactic is particularly dangerous because it creates a psychological debt. When someone compliments us, we naturally feel obligated to reciprocate or return the favor in some way. Manipulators understand this principle of reciprocity and use false flattery to create artificial obligations. The corporate world sees false flattery regularly, where colleagues might praise a boss excessively to gain promotions or favorable treatment. In personal relationships, it appears when someone uses charm and compliments to mask their true intentions, whether seeking money, favors, or emotional manipulation. Recognizing false flattery requires paying attention to patterns. Does the praise feel genuine or rehearsed? Is it followed by requests? Does the person offering compliments barely know you well enough to make such assessments? Authentic compliments feel natural and unconditional, while false flattery often feels forced or strategically placed. The psychological impact of false flattery can be significant. Victims may develop skewed self-perceptions, become dependent on external validation, or lose trust in genuine compliments. It can also create confusion about relationships and make it harder to distinguish between authentic and manipulative social interactions. Guilt tripping. Guilt tripping is a manipulative emotional tactic where someone deliberately makes another person feel guilty, ashamed, or responsible for causing distress in order to control their behavior or get what they want. This psychological manipulation exploits our natural empathy and moral compass, turning these positive traits against us to achieve compliance. The mechanism behind guilt tripping works by triggering our innate desire to be good people who don't cause harm to others. When someone suggests we've hurt them or failed in our responsibilities, we experience psychological discomfort that we naturally want to resolve. Manipulators exploit this discomfort by positioning themselves as victims and us as the cause of their suffering. Guilt tripping often involves exaggerated emotional responses, passive-aggressive comments, or dramatic statements designed to maximize emotional impact. Common phrases include, "After everything I've done for you, I guess I'm not important to you," or "You're breaking my heart." These statements are crafted to make the target feel like a terrible person for not complying with the manipulator's wishes. This tactic is particularly insidious because it weaponizes relationships and emotional bonds. Parents might guilt-trip children by saying things like, "You never call me anymore," not to express genuine hurt, but to control the child's behavior. Romantic partners might use guilt to prevent their significant other from spending time with friends, claiming it makes them feel abandoned or unloved. The psychological impact of chronic guilt tripping can be severe. Victims often develop anxiety, depression, and a distorted sense of responsibility for others' emotions. They may lose their ability to set healthy boundaries, constantly second-guessing their decisions and prioritizing others' feelings over their own well-being. This creates a cycle where the victim becomes increasingly susceptible to manipulation. Guilt tripping differs from healthy communication about hurt feelings. Legitimate concerns are expressed directly, focus on specific behaviors rather than character attacks, and aim for resolution rather than control. Guilt tripping, conversely, is about power and getting one's way through emotional manipulation rather than honest dialogue. The workplace sees guilt tripping when managers suggest that employees who don't work overtime are letting the team down, or when colleagues imply that taking vacation days shows lack of dedication. In families, it appears when relatives use phrases like "family comes first" to override individual boundaries and needs. Recognizing guilt tripping requires understanding that you're not responsible for managing other people's emotions or constantly sacrificing your needs to avoid their distress. Healthy relationships involve mutual respect and direct communication, not emotional manipulation designed to control behavior through artificial guilt. The contrast principle. The contrast principle is a psychological phenomenon where our perception of something is heavily influenced by what we experience immediately before it. This cognitive bias affects how we evaluate options, make decisions, and judge value by comparing new information against recent reference points rather than assessing it independently. This principle operates because our brains are wired to notice differences and changes rather than absolute values. When we encounter two stimuli in sequence, we automatically compare them, and this comparison shapes our judgment more than the objective qualities of each item. The contrast becomes the primary factor in our evaluation process, often overriding rational analysis. In sales and marketing, the contrast principle is extensively exploited. Car dealerships might show customers an expensive luxury model first, making the mid-range option seem reasonably priced by comparison. Real estate agents often begin house tours with less desirable properties, making subsequent homes appear more attractive. Restaurants place expensive items at the top of their menus to make other dishes seem more affordable, even if those prices are still above average. The principle also affects how we perceive physical sensations. If you put one hand in hot water and another in cold water, then place both hands in lukewarm water, the same temperature will feel cold to one hand and warm to the other. This same mechanism applies to emotional and psychological experiences, where our recent emotional state influences how we interpret new situations. Retailers use this principle through decoy pricing strategies. They might offer three versions of a product: a basic model, an expensive premium model, and a mid-range option. The expensive model isn't necessarily meant to sell in large quantities but serves to make the mid-range option appear like excellent value. Without the expensive contrast, customers might view the mid-range price as too high. The contrast principle can lead to poor decision-making when we focus too heavily on comparisons rather than absolute value or our actual needs. Someone might buy an expensive item simply because it seems reasonable compared to an even more expensive alternative, not because they actually need or can afford it. This psychological bias also affects our social interactions and self-perception. If we spend time with people who complain constantly, a normally optimistic person might seem extraordinarily positive by contrast. Conversely, being around highly successful individuals might make our own achievements feel inadequate, even if they're objectively impressive. Understanding the contrast principle helps us make more informed decisions by recognizing when our judgments are being influenced by artificial comparisons. It encourages us to step back and evaluate options based on our actual needs, budget, and circumstances rather than relative positioning designed to manipulate our perceptions. Intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is a psychological conditioning technique where rewards or positive responses are given unpredictably and sporadically rather than consistently. This creates one of the most powerful and addictive behavioral patterns known to psychology, making it extremely difficult for people to break free from situations or relationships that employ this tactic. The power of intermittent reinforcement lies in its unpredictability. When we receive rewards consistently, we adapt to them and they lose their motivational power. However, when rewards come randomly and infrequently, our brains become hypervigilant, constantly hoping for the next positive experience. This creates a psychological state similar to gambling addiction, where the uncertainty of when the next reward will come keeps us engaged far longer than consistent rewards would. This principle was discovered through experiments with laboratory animals, where researchers found that animals would press levers much more persistently when food pellets were delivered randomly rather than after every press. The animals couldn't predict when the reward would come, so they kept trying indefinitely, even when rewards became very rare. In human relationships, intermittent reinforcement often appears in toxic dynamics. An abusive partner might alternate between cruel treatment and sudden displays of affection or kindness. The unpredictable nature of these positive moments creates intense emotional bonds, making it difficult for victims to leave despite the overall negative experience. The rare moments of kindness feel extraordinarily powerful because they contrast sharply with the usual mistreatment. Social media platforms exploit intermittent reinforcement through likes, comments, and notifications. Users never know when they'll receive positive feedback, so they check their accounts compulsively, hoping for the next social reward. The unpredictable nature of these interactions creates addictive usage patterns that keep people scrolling for hours. Workplaces might use intermittent reinforcement through unpredictable praise or recognition. Employees might work extremely hard hoping to receive acknowledgement, even when such recognition is rare and inconsistent. This can create unhealthy work environments where people exhaust themselves chasing sporadic approval. The gambling industry is built entirely on intermittent reinforcement. Slot machines, lottery tickets, and casino games provide wins just often enough to keep players engaged, but infrequently enough to ensure the house always profits. The unpredictable nature of wins creates powerful psychological hooks that can lead to addiction. Breaking free from intermittent reinforcement requires recognizing the pattern and understanding that the occasional positive experiences don't justify ongoing negative treatment. It involves setting consistent standards for how we expect to be treated and not allowing rare positive moments to override patterns of neglect or abuse. The fear-then-relief trick. The fear-then-relief trick is a psychological manipulation technique where someone deliberately creates anxiety, fear, or distress in another person and then presents themselves as the solution or source of relief. This creates a powerful emotional bond and sense of gratitude toward the manipulator, even though they were the original cause of the distress. This tactic works by exploiting our natural stress response system. When we experience fear or anxiety, our bodies flood with stress hormones, creating an intense desire to escape the uncomfortable situation. When relief comes, our brains release chemicals like dopamine and endorphins, creating feelings of gratitude and attachment toward whoever provided that relief. The manipulator becomes associated with safety and rescue rather than the original threat. The technique is particularly insidious because it creates artificial crises followed by artificial solutions. The person using this tactic might create problems, spread alarming information, or manufacture emergencies, then swoop in as the hero who can fix everything. This positions them as indispensable and trustworthy, despite being the source of the original problem. In abusive relationships, this pattern is common where an abuser creates emotional turmoil through criticism, threats, or unpredictable behavior, then provides comfort and reassurance. The victim begins to associate their abuser with safety and relief rather than recognizing them as the source of their distress. This creates trauma bonding, making it extremely difficult to leave the relationship. Sales professionals sometimes employ this technique by creating artificial urgency or highlighting potential problems, then presenting their product or service as the solution. They might emphasize security threats, market instability, or missed opportunities to create anxiety, then position their offering as providing peace of mind and protection. Political manipulation often uses fear then relief tactics, where leaders highlight threats or crises, then present themselves as the only ones capable of providing safety and solutions. This can create strong emotional loyalty that overrides rational evaluation of policies or track records. The workplace might see this pattern when managers create artificial deadlines or crises, then present themselves as supportive leaders when they help resolve the problems they created. Employees may feel grateful for their manager's assistance while failing to recognize that the stress was manufactured. This psychological trick is effective because it bypasses our rational thinking. When we're in a state of fear or stress, we're more focused on immediate relief than on analyzing the situation objectively. The emotional intensity of the fear relief cycle creates strong memories and associations that can override logical assessment. Recognizing this manipulation requires stepping back during calm moments to analyze patterns. Are crises consistently followed by the same person offering solutions? Does someone seem to benefit from problems they claim to solve? Understanding this pattern helps maintain perspective and avoid being manipulated through manufactured emotional cycles. Reverse psychology. Reverse psychology is a manipulative technique where someone suggests or advocates for the opposite of what they actually want, with the intention of prompting the target person to do what the manipulator truly desires. This psychological tactic exploits our natural tendency toward reactance, which is the human impulse to resist being controlled or told what to do. The effectiveness of reverse psychology stems from our fundamental need for autonomy and independence. When someone tells us we cannot or should not do something, we often experience a psychological urge to prove our freedom by doing exactly that thing. Manipulators exploit this predictable response by framing their true desires as restrictions or impossibilities, knowing that the target will likely rebel against these apparent limitations. This technique works particularly well with people who have strong personalities, high self-esteem, or rebellious tendencies. The manipulator might say something like, "You probably couldn't handle this challenge," or, "I don't think you're ready for this responsibility," knowing that the target will want to prove them wrong. By appearing to discourage the desired behavior, they actually encourage it. Parents sometimes use reverse psychology with children, saying things like, "Don't clean your room," when they actually want the child to tidy up. While this might seem harmless, it can create confusion about authentic communication and teach children that manipulation is acceptable in relationships. It undermines trust and honest dialogue. In romantic relationships, reverse psychology can be particularly toxic. A partner might say, "Maybe you should go out with your friends," while displaying body language or tone that suggests they want the opposite. This creates a double bind where the target cannot win, either disappointing their partner by going out or feeling controlled by staying home. The workplace sees reverse psychology when managers suggest that certain employees probably aren't cut out for challenging projects, knowing that ambitious workers will volunteer to prove their capabilities. This manipulation can lead to overwork and exploitation of employees' desire to demonstrate their worth. The danger of reverse psychology lies in its deceptive nature. It prevents genuine communication and can damage relationships by creating an atmosphere of mistrust and manipulation. Recipients may begin to question whether communications are sincere or calculated, leading to anxiety and confusion about others' true intentions. Recognizing reverse psychology requires paying attention to inconsistencies between someone's words and their apparent desires or motivations. Healthy relationships involve direct, honest communication about wants and needs rather than manipulation tactics designed to trick people into compliance. Triangulation. Triangulation is a manipulative psychological tactic where someone involves a third party in a conflict or relationship dynamic to avoid direct communication, gain power, or create drama. This technique transforms a simple two-person interaction into a complex triangle, often leaving all parties confused, frustrated, and emotionally manipulated. The core mechanism of triangulation involves redirecting communication through an intermediary rather than addressing issues directly with the person involved. The manipulator might complain to person A about person B, then tell person B what person A supposedly said, creating conflict between the two while positioning themselves as the central figure who controls information flow. This tactic serves multiple purposes for the manipulator. It allows them to avoid direct confrontation while still expressing their grievances. It creates drama and chaos that can distract from their own problematic behavior. Most importantly, it places them in a position of power as the hub of all communication, making others dependent on them for information about each other's thoughts and feelings. In family dynamics, triangulation often appears when a parent involves a child in adult conflicts. Rather than addressing marital problems directly with their spouse, a parent might complain to their child about the other parent, seeking sympathy and alliance. This places the child in an impossible position, forcing them to choose sides and carrying emotional burdens inappropriate for their age. Workplace triangulation occurs when colleagues avoid direct communication about conflicts, instead complaining to supervisors, other coworkers, or human resources. This creates a toxic environment where rumors spread, relationships deteriorate, and actual problems remain unresolved because the parties involved never communicate directly. Romantic relationships see triangulation when partners bring friends, family members, or even ex-partners into their conflicts. Instead of working through issues together, they seek validation from others or use third parties to deliver messages, creating unnecessary drama and avoiding the vulnerability required for genuine intimacy. The psychological impact of triangulation is significant for all parties involved. The primary targets often feel confused and betrayed, unsure who said what or where they stand in relationships. The third parties dragged into conflicts experience stress and divided loyalties. Even the manipulator suffers, as they never develop healthy communication skills and often find themselves isolated when others recognize the pattern. Triangulation prevents authentic relationships and problem-solving. It creates an atmosphere of mistrust, gossip, and indirect communication that makes it impossible to address real issues. The constant drama and confusion can be emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Recognizing triangulation involves identifying when someone consistently involves others in conflicts instead of addressing issues directly. Healthy relationships require direct communication between the parties involved, not manipulation through intermediaries. The silent treatment. The silent treatment is a form of emotional abuse and manipulation where someone deliberately withholds communication, affection, or acknowledgement from another person as a way to punish, control, or express displeasure. This psychological weapon uses our fundamental human need for connection and communication against us, creating intense emotional distress through deliberate isolation. The silent treatment works by exploiting our basic social needs. Humans are inherently social creatures who require interaction, validation, and connection to feel psychologically secure. When someone suddenly withdraws all communication, it triggers our attachment system and creates anxiety, confusion, and desperation. The silence becomes a form of psychological torture that can be more damaging than direct confrontation or argument. This manipulation tactic differs significantly from taking healthy space or time to cool down during conflicts. Healthy communication breaks involve clearly expressed needs like, "I need some time to think about this," with specified time frames and intentions to resume discussion. The silent treatment, however, is punitive, indefinite, and designed to cause maximum emotional distress without any constructive purpose. The person giving the silent treatment maintains complete control over the situation. They decide when the punishment begins, how long it lasts, and what conditions might end it. This power dynamic creates an imbalance where the recipient becomes desperate to restore communication, often accepting blame or making concessions they wouldn't normally make just to end the painful silence. In romantic relationships, the silent treatment can be devastating. Partners who use this tactic might suddenly stop responding to texts, refuse to make eye contact, or act as if their significant other doesn't exist. The recipient often experiences intense anxiety, self-doubt, and desperation, frantically trying to figure out what they did wrong and how to fix it. Parent-child relationships can be severely damaged by the silent treatment. Children who experience this form of emotional withdrawal from caregivers may develop attachment issues, anxiety disorders, and difficulty trusting others. The psychological impact can last into adulthood, affecting their ability to form healthy relationships. Workplace silent treatment might involve colleagues or supervisors suddenly excluding someone from meetings, conversations, or social interactions. This creates a hostile work environment and can severely impact job performance and mental health. The silent treatment is particularly cruel because it offers no opportunity for resolution or understanding. Unlike arguments or direct confrontation, there's no dialogue, no chance to explain, apologize, or work through issues. The recipient is left in psychological limbo, unable to address the problem because they're shut out completely. Recovery from the silent treatment requires recognizing that this behavior is abusive and unacceptable. Healthy relationships involve direct communication about problems, not punishment through emotional withdrawal and manipulation. Illusory truth effect. The illusory truth effect is a cognitive bias where people are more likely to believe information as true simply because they have heard it repeatedly, regardless of whether the information is actually accurate. This psychological phenomenon demonstrates how repetition can override critical thinking and create false confidence in the validity of statements, even when we should know better. This effect occurs because our brains use familiarity as a shortcut for determining truth. When we encounter information multiple times, it becomes easier to process and feels more familiar, which our minds unconsciously interpret as a sign of accuracy. The repeated exposure creates a sense of cognitive fluency that we mistake for credibility, even when the information comes from unreliable sources or lacks factual support. The illusory truth effect is particularly dangerous because it doesn't require us to consciously accept the information initially. Even when we're skeptical the first time we hear something, repeated exposure gradually wears down our resistance. Our brains begin to treat the familiar statement as more credible than unfamiliar but potentially more accurate information. Advertising and marketing industries have long exploited this psychological vulnerability. Companies repeat their slogans, brand messages, and product claims across multiple platforms and time frames, knowing that familiarity will breed belief. Consumers begin to accept these messages as factual simply through exposure, even when the claims are exaggerated or misleading. Political propaganda relies heavily on the illusory truth effect. Politicians and media outlets repeat certain narratives, statistics, or characterizations until they become accepted as conventional wisdom. Citizens may begin believing these repeated messages despite lacking independent verification or critical analysis of the claims being made. Social media amplifies this effect dramatically. False information can spread rapidly through shares, reposts, and comments, creating the impression of widespread belief and validity. The same misleading story might appear in someone's feed multiple times from different sources, each repetition increasing the likelihood they'll accept it as true. The effect is especially problematic because it operates below our conscious awareness. We might pride ourselves on being skeptical and fact-checking information, yet still fall victim to the illusory truth effect when claims are repeated frequently enough. Even people with strong critical thinking skills can be influenced by this bias. Educational and professional settings aren't immune to this phenomenon. Students might begin believing incorrect information that appears repeatedly in their materials, and professionals might accept industry myths that are frequently repeated in their field without proper verification. Combating the illusory truth effect requires deliberate effort to question repeated claims and seek independent verification. It means recognizing that familiarity doesn't equal accuracy and developing habits of critical evaluation that don't rely on how often we've encountered particular information. Gaslighting. Gaslighting is a severe form of psychological manipulation where someone systematically undermines another person's perception of reality, memory, and judgment. The manipulator deliberately distorts facts, denies events that occurred, and questions the victim's mental stability to gain control and power over them. This insidious tactic gradually erodes the victim's confidence in their own experiences and decision-making abilities. The term originates from a 1944 film where a husband manipulates his wife into believing she's losing her sanity by dimming gas lights while denying their flickering. This perfectly illustrates how gaslighting works. The manipulator creates a false reality while insisting the victim's accurate perceptions are wrong, crazy, or imagined. Gaslighting typically follows predictable patterns. The manipulator might deny conversations that clearly happened, claiming, "I never said that," or "you're imagining things." They might minimize the victim's feelings by saying, "You're too sensitive," or "You're overreacting," to legitimate concerns. They often rewrite history by changing details of past events or claiming the victim remembers things incorrectly. This manipulation is particularly effective because it targets our fundamental trust in our own perceptions. When someone consistently questions our memory and judgment, especially someone we trust or depend on, we begin to doubt ourselves. The victim starts questioning their own sanity, wondering if they really are too sensitive, forgetful, or unstable. Gaslighting appears frequently in abusive relationships where the abuser denies their harmful behavior while blaming the victim for causing problems. They might say things like, "I wouldn't have to yell if you weren't so difficult," or "You made me do this," after engaging in clearly inappropriate behavior. This shifts responsibility away from the abuser while making the victim question their role in the abuse. Workplace gaslighting occurs when supervisors or colleagues deny promises they made, question the victim's competence despite evidence to the contrary, or claim the victim is being too emotional when raising legitimate concerns. This creates a hostile environment where the victim doubts their professional abilities and perception of workplace dynamics. The psychological damage from gaslighting can be severe and long-lasting. Victims often develop anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. They may lose confidence in their decision-making abilities and become dependent on others to validate their experiences. The constant questioning of reality can lead to a phenomenon called learned helplessness, where victims stop trusting their own judgment entirely. Recovery from gaslighting requires rebuilding trust in one's own perceptions and experiences. This often involves documenting interactions, seeking outside perspectives from trusted friends or professionals, and learning to recognize the tactics used by manipulators. Understanding that gaslighting is about the manipulator's need for control, not the victim's inadequacy, is crucial for healing. Time pressure. Time pressure is a psychological manipulation technique that exploits our natural tendency to make rushed decisions when we feel constrained by limited time. This concept operates on the principle that when people perceive they have insufficient time to make a thoughtful decision, they often default to less rational thinking patterns and become more susceptible to external influence. The human brain has evolved two primary decision-making systems. The first is our deliberate, analytical thinking process that carefully weighs options, considers consequences, and makes reasoned choices. The second is our rapid, instinctive response system that helps us react quickly to immediate threats or opportunities. Time pressure deliberately triggers this second system, bypassing our more careful analytical processes. When someone creates artificial time constraints, they're essentially forcing your brain into emergency mode. This state makes you more likely to accept the first reasonable-sounding option presented, rather than taking time to explore alternatives or question the validity of the pressure itself. The urgency creates a tunnel vision effect where you focus intensely on avoiding the perceived negative consequence of missing the deadline, rather than evaluating whether the opportunity or threat is genuine. This technique appears frequently in sales environments, where phrases like "limited time offer," "only 3 left in stock," or "sale ends tonight," create manufactured urgency. The manipulation works because it taps into our fear of missing out and our natural aversion to regret. We imagine how we'll feel if we don't act quickly and the opportunity disappears, even when logic might suggest the opportunity isn't as valuable or as fleeting as presented. Time pressure also affects our ability to seek additional information or consult with others. When someone says you must decide immediately, they're deliberately preventing you from gathering facts, comparing options, or seeking advice from trusted sources. This isolation in decision-making is particularly effective because many of our best choices come from collaborative thinking or taking time to research. The psychological stress created by time pressure can also impair memory and judgment. Under pressure, people often forget important details, overlook obvious red flags, or fail to ask crucial questions they would normally consider. This mental state makes individuals more compliant and less likely to challenge authority or question the legitimacy of the time constraint. Recognizing time pressure manipulation involves stepping back and asking whether the urgency is real or manufactured. Legitimate time-sensitive situations usually have clear, logical reasons for the constraint. Artificial pressure often crumbles under simple questions about why the deadline exists or what would actually happen if you took more time to decide. Planned vulnerability. Planned vulnerability is a deliberate psychological manipulation strategy where someone intentionally reveals personal weaknesses, struggles, or intimate details about themselves to create a false sense of connection and trust with their target. This technique exploits our natural human tendency to feel closer to people who appear open and authentic by sharing their vulnerabilities with us. The manipulation works by triggering our reciprocity instinct and empathy response. When someone shares something deeply personal, we naturally feel honored by their trust and often feel compelled to reciprocate with our own personal information. This creates an artificial bond that feels genuine but is actually calculated to lower our defenses and make us more susceptible to future requests or influence. Unlike genuine vulnerability, which emerges naturally from authentic relationships and mutual trust building over time, planned vulnerability is strategically deployed at specific moments to achieve particular outcomes. The manipulator carefully selects which personal details to share based on what they believe will most effectively influence their target. They might reveal financial struggles to justify asking for money, share relationship problems to appear more relatable, or discuss past traumas to generate sympathy and protective instincts. This technique is particularly insidious because it feels like authentic human connection. The target experiences genuine emotions of empathy, compassion, and closeness, making it extremely difficult to recognize the manipulation. The shared vulnerability creates a psychological investment where the target now feels responsible for the manipulator's well-being or success. Planned vulnerability often appears in romantic scams, where perpetrators share fabricated stories of loss, hardship, or emotional pain to accelerate intimacy and justify eventual requests for financial assistance. It's also common in professional settings, where someone might strategically reveal personal challenges to gain sympathy during performance reviews or to justify poor behavior. The timing of planned vulnerability is crucial to its effectiveness. Manipulators often deploy this technique when they sense resistance or when they need to deepen a relationship quickly. They might share their vulnerability just before making a significant request, or use it to deflect criticism by positioning themselves as the victim of circumstances beyond their control. What makes planned vulnerability particularly damaging is that it weaponizes human compassion. It takes advantage of our best instincts to help and connect with others, turning these positive traits against us. Victims often struggle with guilt when they eventually recognize the manipulation, wondering if they were too suspicious or if they failed to help someone genuinely in need. Protecting yourself from planned vulnerability requires paying attention to timing and consistency. Genuine vulnerability typically emerges gradually as relationships develop naturally. Be cautious when someone shares very personal information early in a relationship or immediately before asking for something. Also notice whether their vulnerability stories consistently position you as the solution to their problems. Guilt seeding. Guilt seeding is a psychological manipulation technique where someone deliberately plants feelings of guilt or responsibility in another person to influence their future behavior and decisions. This method involves creating situations or making statements that make the target feel as though they have done something wrong, failed to meet expectations, or bear responsibility for someone else's problems or emotions. The technique works by exploiting our natural desire to be good people and maintain positive relationships with others. Most individuals have an internal moral compass that creates discomfort when they believe they've caused harm or failed to help someone in need. Guilt-seeding manipulators understand this psychological mechanism and deliberately trigger these feelings to gain compliance and control. The process typically begins subtly, with seemingly innocent comments or observations that contain implied criticism or disappointment. For example, someone might say, "I guess not everyone cares about family traditions like I do," when you decline an invitation, or "I understand you're too busy for old friends," when you can't immediately respond to a message. These statements don't directly accuse you of wrongdoing, but they plant seeds of doubt about your character or priorities. Over time, these small guilt seeds accumulate and create a baseline feeling of indebtedness or inadequacy. The manipulator builds a narrative where you consistently fall short of being the kind of person you want to be, whether as a friend, family member, partner, or colleague. This emotional foundation makes you more likely to say yes to future requests, even unreasonable ones, as a way to prove your worth and alleviate the accumulated guilt. Guilt seeding is particularly effective because it operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. The target often doesn't recognize they're being manipulated because the guilt feels legitimate and self-generated. They believe they genuinely should feel bad about their actions or inactions, rather than recognizing that these feelings have been artificially cultivated by someone else. This technique frequently appears in toxic relationships, where one person consistently makes the other feel responsible for their emotions, failures, or circumstances. Parents might use guilt seeding with adult children by constantly referencing sacrifices they made or expressing disappointment about lack of contact. Partners might plant guilt about past mistakes or suggest that their happiness depends entirely on their significant other's behavior. Professional environments also see guilt seeding, where managers or colleagues might make comments about team dedication, work ethic, or commitment that make others feel inadequate or selfish for setting boundaries or prioritizing personal needs. The long-term effects of guilt seeding can be devastating to mental health and decision-making autonomy. Victims often develop chronic anxiety, people-pleasing behaviors, and difficulty distinguishing between appropriate responsibility and manipulated guilt. They may find themselves constantly trying to prove their worth through excessive accommodation and self-sacrifice. Recognizing guilt seeding requires developing awareness of your emotional responses to specific people and situations. Notice when certain individuals consistently leave you feeling guilty, inadequate, or responsible for their well-being. Pay attention to subtle implications and loaded language designed to make you question your character or choices. False consensus effect. False consensus effect is a cognitive bias where individuals overestimate how much other people share their beliefs, opinions, attitudes, and behaviors. This psychological phenomenon leads people to assume that their own perspectives are more common and widely accepted than they actually are, creating a distorted sense of social reality that can be exploited by manipulators. The effect occurs because we naturally use ourselves as a reference point for understanding others. Our own thoughts, feelings, and reactions feel normal and reasonable to us, so we project these onto other people, assuming they would think and act similarly in comparable situations. This mental shortcut helps us navigate social interactions quickly, but it also creates blind spots in our understanding of how diverse human perspectives actually are. Manipulators exploit the false consensus effect by making statements that seem to represent widespread opinion or social norms. They might say things like, "Everyone knows that," "most people would agree," or "it's common sense that," before presenting their particular viewpoint. These phrases trigger our assumption that the speaker's perspective aligns with general social consensus, making us more likely to accept their claims without questioning or seeking evidence. This technique is particularly effective in group settings, where individuals may doubt their own judgment if they believe everyone else shares a different opinion. Someone might go along with a decision they privately disagree with because they assume their perspective is unusual or unpopular. The manipulator doesn't need to prove that consensus actually exists, they simply need to create the impression that it does. Social media and echo chambers amplify the false consensus effect by surrounding us with like-minded individuals who reinforce our existing beliefs. This creates an artificially narrow sample of human opinion, making our own views seem more universal than they truly are. Manipulators can exploit this by referencing popular opinions within specific online communities as if they represent broader social consensus. The effect also influences how we interpret other people's behavior. When someone acts differently than we would expect, we might assume they're being deceptive, irrational, or deliberately contrarian, rather than recognizing that they may simply have different values, experiences, or information that lead to different conclusions. In political and social contexts, false consensus effect can be weaponized to marginalize dissenting voices or rush people into decisions. Phrases like "any reasonable person would," "obviously everyone wants," or "it's clear that most people support," are often used to shut down debate and make alternative viewpoints seem fringe or extreme. The psychological pressure created by perceived consensus can override individual critical thinking. People may abandon their own careful analysis in favor of going along with what they believe everyone else thinks, even when that consensus is artificially manufactured or completely fictional. Protecting yourself from false consensus manipulation requires actively seeking diverse perspectives and questioning claims about what everyone thinks or believes. Before accepting statements about popular opinion, consider whether you have actual evidence of widespread agreement or if you're simply being told that consensus exists. Remember that your own social circles and information sources may not represent the full spectrum of human opinion. Forced commitment. Forced commitment is a psychological manipulation technique where someone pressures another person into making a promise, agreement, or public declaration that they can later use to control future behavior. This method exploits our natural tendency to remain consistent with our previous statements and commitments, even when circumstances change or we realize the commitment was made under pressure or false pretenses. The technique operates on the principle of cognitive consistency, a fundamental aspect of human psychology where we feel internal discomfort when our actions don't align with our stated beliefs or promises. Once we've committed to something, especially publicly, we experience psychological pressure to follow through, even if the commitment no longer serves our best interests or was obtained through manipulation. Forced commitment often begins with seemingly innocent requests for agreement or acknowledgement. The manipulator might ask you to confirm that you value honesty, care about family, or want to be seen as reliable. These initial commitments seem harmless and align with positive values most people hold. However, the manipulator then uses these general commitments to justify specific requests or demands that you might otherwise refuse. The pressure to make the commitment can take many forms. Sometimes it's explicit, where someone directly asks you to promise something or make a public declaration. Other times it's more subtle, where circumstances are arranged so that refusing to commit makes you appear unreasonable, selfish, or inconsistent with your stated values. The manipulator might create time pressure, social pressure, or emotional pressure to secure the commitment quickly before you have time to fully consider the implications. Once the commitment is made, the manipulator can reference it repeatedly to justify future requests or to make you feel guilty for wanting to change your mind. They might say things like, "But you promised, you said you cared about this," or "I thought I could count on you to keep your word." This creates a psychological trap where backing out of the commitment feels like betraying your own integrity or letting others down. Public commitments are particularly powerful because they involve your reputation and social standing. When others are aware of your promise or agreement, the stakes feel higher for following through. The manipulator might deliberately make your commitment public or reference it in front of others to increase the pressure you feel to comply. This technique appears frequently in sales situations, where customers are asked to agree to abstract principles before being presented with specific offers. Religious and political organizations also use forced commitment by securing agreement to broad values or beliefs that can later justify specific actions or donations. In personal relationships, someone might extract promises about loyalty, support, or behavior that they later use to control or guilt their partner. The most insidious aspect of forced commitment is that it makes victims complicit in their own manipulation. Because they voluntarily made the commitment, they often blame themselves for any negative consequences rather than recognizing that the commitment was obtained through pressure or deception. Protecting yourself requires recognizing when someone is trying to lock you into agreements before you fully understand the implications. Be wary of requests for immediate commitments, especially those framed in terms of your character or values. Take time to consider what you're really agreeing to and what future obligations might stem from your commitment. Love bombing. Love bombing is an intense manipulation tactic where someone overwhelms their target with excessive displays of affection, attention, and adoration in order to gain emotional control and create psychological dependency. This technique involves showering the victim with an almost overwhelming amount of love, praise, gifts, and romantic gestures that seem too good to be true because they genuinely are calculated rather than authentic. The manipulator deploying love bombing creates an artificial sense of intense connection and perfect compatibility by mirroring the target's interests, values, and desires while presenting themselves as the ideal partner or friend. They might declare their love unusually early in the relationship, make grand romantic gestures, give expensive gifts, send constant messages throughout the day, and make the target feel like they're the most special person in the world. This bombardment of positive attention creates powerful emotional highs that become psychologically addictive. The technique works by exploiting our natural human needs for love, validation, and connection. When someone receives this level of intense attention, especially if they've experienced loneliness, rejection, or low self-esteem in the past, the experience can feel like a dream come true. The brain releases dopamine and other feel-good chemicals in response to this flood of positive reinforcement, creating genuine biochemical addiction to the relationship and the manipulator's attention. Love bombing serves several strategic purposes for the manipulator. First, it accelerates intimacy and emotional investment, causing the target to become deeply attached before they have time to notice red flags or inconsistencies. Second, it establishes a baseline of extraordinary treatment that the manipulator can later withdraw to create anxiety and desperation. Third, it creates cognitive dissonance where the target struggles to reconcile the amazing person they fell in love with against any negative behaviors that emerge later. The intensity and speed of love bombing often override rational thinking and natural caution. Targets frequently ignore advice from friends and family who express concern about the relationship moving too quickly or the partner seeming too perfect. The emotional high created by constant attention and validation makes it difficult to think clearly about whether the relationship is healthy or sustainable. Once the target is emotionally hooked, the manipulator typically begins to withdraw the excessive attention and affection. This creates a painful contrast that leaves the victim desperately trying to return to the initial perfect phase of the relationship. They may change their behavior, compromise their boundaries, or tolerate increasingly problematic treatment in hopes of recapturing those early feelings of being adored and cherished. Love bombing appears frequently in romantic relationships with narcissists and sociopaths, but it can also occur in friendships, family relationships, and even professional settings where someone wants to gain influence or control. Religious groups and cults often use love bombing to recruit new members by making them feel immediately accepted and valued within the community. The aftermath of love bombing can be devastating for victims, who often blame themselves for the relationship's deterioration and struggle with feelings of worthlessness when the excessive attention disappears. They may spend years trying to understand what they did wrong or how they can earn back that initial treatment. Recognizing love bombing requires paying attention to the pace and intensity of developing relationships, trusting your instincts when something feels too perfect, and maintaining connections with trusted friends and family who can provide outside perspective.